welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson, and today we are continuing with Brahms's 6 pieces, Opus 118, with the third piece, the Ballade. This is a very different sort of ballade from the more famous ballades of Chopin or Brahms's own ballades, Opus 10. It's a very short, tightly constructed piece, very vigorous and rhythmical. Despite its brevity, there is something kind of grandiose about it, which is partly created by the bravura pianistic writing. This is definitely one of those pieces that sounds much harder than it actually is. I wouldn't go so far as to saying that it's easy by any stretch, but Brahms has some very clever pianistic things that he does, particularly when it comes to sharing these thick chords between both hands. That makes it very effective and sound actually much more difficult than it really is. And actually you'll find that quite frequently in piano writing. The technique which composers since Liszt have really used to make their writing sound very brilliant, even if it isn't so difficult, is using the two hands in this kind of way, alternating between the two hands to make it sound as if there are many more notes than there really are. So there are some very typical Brahmsian techniques at play in this piece, one of which is uneven phrase lengths. The opening phrase is actually 10 bars to 5-bar phraselets. And I think it really is this which helps to lend this slightly archaic sound to this opening phrase. And I wanted to kind of demonstrate what I really mean by this, because you always hear about, this composer writes in uneven phrase lengths. Instead of using 8-bar phrases, they're writing in 10 bars or whatever. But I find that it's not always obvious to the lay listener what that really means. So I took the liberty of recomposing this first phrase to turn it into an 8-bar phrase. And I did this by eliminating these measures right here that I have circled. These are the measures which I feel like are the added measures if we're talking about a regular 8-bar phrase. So here's what it sounds like turned into an 8-bar phrase with these two measures left out. And I mean, it actually sounds fine if you can get used to that, but it's so much more effective with these added bars, the way that Brahms kind of stretches these phrases out using the added bars. So here it is in the version that Brahms came up with. So it's a subtle difference, but you can see how that really adds to the effect of the phrase. And these added bars also connect to some later material, which I'll talk about in a minute. So jumping forward a little bit, this piece is in ternary form and talking about the transition in between the A section and the B section. Part of how Brahms makes this piece sound so tightly constructed is that he has the transitions contain overlap of melodic material. So the rhythmic motive that the B section melody is comprised of starts several bars early, and the accompaniment as well kind of starts warming up in these few bars before the B section actually starts. And there's another very surprising move that Brahms makes here, a very surprising harmonic move, which if you've heard the piece a lot, you might take it for granted, but it's kind of weird the first time you're playing through or when you're actually studying the score. Brahms actually sets this up as if he's going to go into either C minor or C major in the B section, which would be a much more normal key to go to. That would be the subdominant key for G minor. So he sets this transition up with the G chord, the G dominant 7th chord, but then he slips into B major, a half step low, instead of C major. And B major is very distant from G minor, so it really gives this middle section kind of this unearthly, distant kind of feeling to it. So here's an example. Here's what it would have sounded like if he had gone to C major, for example. And now here's the actual version going to B major. So again, it's a subtle effect, but very striking. And it's this kind of undercutting of our expectations, which I think really lends this piece its enormous freshness. That's why it's so gripping. Another facet of this piece's marvelously interconnected structure is that the B section rhythm, this rhythm in the melody with the dotted quarter eighth, is actually foreshadowed in the A section. So these added bars, as you recall, I was talking about in the opening phrase, they contain the rhythm for this B section melody. It's always seemed to me like this tight connection between these sections suggests that the middle part should really be in the same tempo as the opening, more or less. A lot of people like to slow down quite a bit in this middle section. I think even Arthur Rubinstein, whose recording is certainly amazing, does slow down quite a bit in the middle section, and it's quite effective in its own way, but I always thought that compositionally it makes more sense if you're playing the middle part in the same tempo. That way you can really hear the connection more clearly. And I was quite pleased when I heard recently some comments made by a kind of legendary pianist Carl Friedberg. Carl Friedberg was a student of Clara Schumann and heard Brahms play, and he heard him play this piece in particular, and he said that Brahms indeed did play this middle section very rapidly at the same tempo as the opening. There's another very curious and detailed notation that Brahms uses here as well. You'll notice that he has a double stem for these notes in the left hand. So a double stem, that suggests that there are two voices at work at once on this note. And at first, that's kind of mystifying. It's kind of hard to tell what he means by this. My own belief is that he's trying to suggest that there's an extra voice which happens to double the accompaniment at this point, but which is actually joining the right hand two-line melody. So this is a very orchestral kind of notation, and it's trying to suggest an orchestral effect on the piano. So I think that it really should sound like, at this moment, the E to the B in the left hand should sound like it's almost joining the right hand melody. So in that sense, you really should not play this part with the left hand totally glossed over in the pedal like this. But instead, I think you should change the pedal on those notes to kind of bring them out, that there's actually this kind of effect going on where the left hand is kind of joining the right hand temporarily on those two notes. There's also a really marvelous moment which doesn't need much explication, but in the middle of this section, Brahms recalls the opening, but in D-sharp minor instead. It's a wonderful moment. Now the opening theme is transformed into this kind of menacing version, very legato, and then immediately Brahms pulls us away back to the B section melody. So after this B section, Brahms has a complete, very classical recapitulation of the A section, and there's a very interesting transition back to this recap. Another place where Brahms kind of pulls the rug out from under our feet harmonically, and you can see actually harmonically there's a very abrupt movement here from A flat major to the C dominant seventh chord, and then to the D dominant seventh chord and back to G minor. This is definitely not correct according to strict harmonic rules. Probably if this transition were quote-unquote correct, it should really have a couple more bars in it. So once again, I took the liberty of inventing a much more correct version, which is also quite banal and square. So here's what I came up with. So, all very well, but you can see how much more effective it is in the original version. Brahms sticks in this wonderful syncopation, which really just slaps us in the face, and it's very, very effective, the way he cuts out the added steps. And I think those are really calling cards of great composers. They will take something which should be a certain way and they will slightly alter it, cut things out or add things in a way that's really interesting and unexpected. Now, after this complete recap, there is another recall to the middle section. We get that middle section melody once more, but this time in G minor. So it has a totally different mood to it. And there's a very fascinating marking at the end of the piece. He marks the last couple bars to be played senza pedale, so no damper pedal. And notice how he writes the fermata in the right hand and also the left hand, and then the rest. This is the most important part. The rest in the left hand is written with a fermata as well. So he actually wants you to release the left hand and hold the right hand for some time. And this is yet another kind of orchestral effect. So here's what it sounds like. So again, very detailed writing where he's really trying to suggest the sound of the orchestra. And you find this kind of technique in many other pieces as well. And it's kind of a shame if you ignore these indications or if you don't notice that they're there, because they're quite striking. And once you're listening for them, you really miss them when they're not there. You miss this kind of orchestral sound. So at the end of the ballade, you might imagine that the woodwinds or horns or some kind of brass ensemble are holding those last notes. Well, maybe the strings were playing the low notes and they release and you still hear this wind or brass chord being held. So another example of this is at the end of Brahms's Clarinet Sonata Opus 120 number 1 in F minor, the first movement, and you can see that the last note in the left hand is marked staccato, whereas the right hand is holding a chord over, which is not staccato. And I always think that the left hand should disappear and you should still hear that right hand chord holding for an instant before silence falls. So that's about it. So please enjoy the complete performance of this wonderful piece coming up in a moment. Please do support the channel as well if you can. I rely on my wonderfully loyal Patreon supporters to help me keep this channel going. So you can sign up to make monthly pledges at www.patreon.com/independent pianist. You can also support the channel by just liking the video, subscribing, and coming back next week. I'll have more great music or conversation for you. So until then, please keep practicing and take care out there.